had told our parents that I was to be allowed to run wild for 3 months to recover my health before starting in a new school. I suppose I was about 6 or 7 and had never known such freedom. With the park to explore and play in, it was like being in the Elysian fields. The warm summer days seemed endless and filled with the delight of new discoveries. I remember being fascinated with the great variety of wildflowers and grasses, and the many-coloured insects of all shapes and sizes that lived among them. I lost all sense of time, and Mother would hang a white sheet out of a bedroom window as a signal that it was time to come home for a meal. Father, meanwhile, spent every spare moment, dressed in his tropical kit from the Indian Regiment, planning and planting the garden. He was helped in this project by Millward, a jobbing gardener, who would arrive on a motorbike with gardening tools in the sidecar. He was a survivor of the trench warfare in the First World War, and must have experienced unspeakable horrors. Young as I was struck by his eyes. They were the saddest eyes I have ever seen. It was while Father was working in the garden one day that Mother said to me, "Go and tell your father dinner's ready." To which I am said to have replied, "Me father? Who's me father?" Of course, he was always called Daddy, and later, when we came under the influence of American films, Pop. Mother was Mummy. She let it be clearly understood that she was not to be called Mum or Ma. Father, who was always known as Farah by the grown-ups, called Mother Kid. I never discovered why, as it didn't really suit her. Mother worked hard at making Kedder Cottage an attractive and comfortable home. Everywhere there was evidence of their sojourn in the Far East. Photographs of their various homes hung on the walls, together with ceremonial swords and beautiful embroidered silks from Japan and China. There was a small black ebony table supported by elephants' heads, complete with ivory tusks. Decorated brass pots and bowls from India, and a large, magnificent round brass table decorated with exotic Hindu gods and goddesses. Both Mother and Father had learnt Hindustani, and would converse in it if they didn't want us to know what they were saying. We picked up a few phrases and names for things ourselves, but I've long forgotten what they were. The time came all too soon for me to start school, and I was sent to a little private school in Long Lane called St. Helen's College. It was run by 2 sisters, the Miss Watsons. I was taught first by the younger one, who called herself Miss Dawson to distinguish herself from her sister. She was large and jolly, and must have been an excellent teacher, because she taught us all to read quickly and painlessly, which added enormously to my enjoyment of life. I remember once we were studying the Tudors in our history lessons, and Mother happened to mention that her grandmother, Jemima, could trace her family back to the Wolseys, which included Cardinal Wolsey. At the next history lesson, I proudly informed Miss Dawson and the class that I was related to Cardinal Wolsey. "Oh," said Miss Dawson, who was used to my vivid imagination, "and how was he related to you?" "I think," I replied, "he was a sort of an uncle." Unfortunately, I was a very bossy and interfering child, and would frequently be admonished by Miss Dawson with, "There's only one little person you have to look after, and that's Betty Gould." I hated being corrected, and I reported a telling off I had received from Miss Dawson to my mother. "And what did you do?" Mother asked, to which I replied, "I gave her one of my looks." In spite of my unattractive ways, I made lots of friends, and never lacked someone to play with. There always seemed to be a child on the doorstep inquiring of Mother, "Can Betty come out to play?" Sometimes, as soon as Joan was old enough, we were sent to Bishop Stortford to stay with Grandpa and his wife, who was known to us as Aunt Jo. They lived in a terrace house on the top of Grange Road, and opposite was a very large Victorian house where the Speechleys had lived. They were a huge family, and all lived to a ripe old age. Dorothy had been at school with Mother, and lived to be 101. Kate, who nearly reached 100, was the most gifted. She could have had a brilliant career as a concert pianist. Her music teacher wanted her to go to Paris to study at the Conservatoire, but her father would not hear of it, and she was never allowed to leave home and live a life of her own until her parents died. In spite of these restrictions, she and Dorothy had a mischievous sense of humour, and were able to keep you helpless with laughter. I can just remember old Mr. Speechley, walking very slowly with the aid of a stick round his large garden. I was told that soon after we returned to England from Australia, Mother took me to visit the Speechleys. Mother was anxious to take a photo of Mr. Speechley and me sitting side by side on a bench. She put us in position and then stood in front of us with her camera. On looking into the viewfinder, she could see Mr. Speechley sitting leaning on his stick, but was surprised to discover that I had vanished. Apparently I had fallen over backwards from the bench, and was found lying on the grass, too surprised to cry out. Bishop Stortford was a brewery town, and the first thing you noticed on arriving by train was the smell of malt. The brewery owned most of the pubs in the vicinity, and Grandpa was employed by the brewery to keep an eye on them and see that they were kept in good order and repair. He was an antiquarian, an amateur historian and archaeologist, and as all the pubs were very old, it was a job that suited him perfectly. He loved these old places, and developed quite an eye for what might lie behind some of the Victorian improvements. He often uncovered and rescued old fireplaces, ancient frescoes, and other interesting features of antiquity. He was a kind and gentle man, with a thatch of thick white hair, and I was very fond of him. He always gave me the most interesting books, and his fascination with history matched my own. He died in 1929, and I have always regretted that our relationship ended when I was 11, and did not extend to when I was older and would have been able to appreciate him even more. I would so like to have known him better. It was always stimulating to stay with him and Aunt Jo. Aunt Jo was a dynamic personality with boundless energy. I think as a young woman she must have been a great admirer of Queen Alexandra, as she dressed exactly like her, with delicate net collars stiffened by little whalebones encircling her neck, She always had a small, snuffly Pekingese dog called Yen, who went everywhere with her. I am sure that it is thanks to them both that I have loved books and reading all my life. Aunt Jo would read to us every day: Alice in Wonderland, David Copperfield, Wind in the Willows, The Secret Garden, a rich heritage of children's classics. But the books I especially enjoyed were by Louisa May Alcott: Little Women, Good Wives, and Jo's Boys. I suppose it was because they described a society and a country that was quite new to me, and yet in spite of this I was able to identify with the character and personality of Jo March. Unfortunately, she also introduced us to Struwwell Peter. Translated from the German, it was a book of terrifying poems intended to shock naughty children into behaving themselves. There were graphic and highly coloured pictures showing the scissor man, who cut off the thumbs, leaving bleeding stumps, of children who sucked their thumbs, or the dreadful end of Harriet, who played with matches, and poor Augustus, who refused to eat his soup, and finally wasted away to nothing. They certainly haunted my dreams for years to come. Aunt Jo was a great gardener, and not only grew flowers in the little garden behind the house, but also had a plot of land further up the road where she grew vegetables. I used to be dragooned into helping her, and we would set off for the vegetable garden, accompanied by Yen, with Aunt Jo in a large straw hat, stout boots, and her long skirt hoisted up to avoid the mud. During one very arduous session, I asked Aunt Jo what she was going to give me for being such a help to her. She said, "I will give you a kiss." It wasn't exactly what I had in mind, but I knew better than to argue with her. From her first marriage, Aunt Jo had a daughter called Dorothy Champ. Dorothy had emigrated to Western Australia and had a fruit farm in Bridgetown. Once in London, Father was passing a greengrocer's and noticed boxes of apples, all labelled Dorothy Champ Farms, Bridgetown, WA. She grew a variety of fruit, and I remember Aunt Jo reading a letter from her and telling us that the peach crop had been wiped out by the cockatoos attacking the fruit. When Grandpa died, Aunt Jo went out to live with her daughter. We used to get delightful letters from her, telling us about the farm and all the animals and birds that lived around them. There was a kangaroo that had injured his tail, and who used to come every day to have it dressed, while Aunt Jo fed him chocolates. Well into her 90s, she would still do her share of work on the farm, climbing up ladders and fixing the roof being her speciality. Her strength of character, her love of books and music, her skill as a gardener, her sense of fun, they were a great influence on my childhood, and I cherish her memory very much. Another delightful relation was Mother's brother Tom. He and his wife Amy bought a house near ours at Hillingdon. They had no children, and Amy was rather cantankerous and difficult. Tom was quite different. Kind and courteous, he was the embodiment of a perfect gentleman. He was so patient with Amy, and I never saw him angry or heard him say anything spiteful or unkind. We all loved him and valued the example he set us. Mother's two other brothers lived abroad, and we never met them. Ted went to South Africa and was seldom heard from, but John went to Australia and wrote regularly to all of us. He was a poet and writer, and life was a hard struggle. Mother would try to help him by sending him a £5 note from the housekeeping from time to time. He married someone called Veronica, and they too had no children. I suppose the most bizarre of all our relations was a cousin of Mother's called Edith Chubb. She had married into the famous firm who make locks and safes. I don't know what it was about Mr. Chubb that made him unsatisfactory as a husband. It was a secret too terrible for discussion. But the marriage was almost immediately annulled, and the family settled a huge sum of money on Edith by way of compensation. This meant that she was able to run a Rolls-Royce car and live comfortably in a luxury flat in Baker Street. The household included a colourful parrot, a faithful maid, Minna, and a young man called Derek, who drove the Rolls and acted as escort and dancing partner for Edith at the various London nightclubs she loved to frequent. He called her Wendy and taught the parrot to say, "Kiss me, Wendy," so I imagine his job description included other duties. I thought he was quite beautiful, with his dark curly hair and charming smile, but Father always referred to him as that gigolo, which I suppose was what he was. Edith seemed to live permanently in the early 1920s and wore cloche hats, long strings of beads, and silk scarves tied tastefully at her throat. As well as her love of dancing, Edith enjoyed visits to Nice in the south of France. She always insisted that Mother accompany her on these expeditions. We were still quite small, so it involved finding someone to come and stay and look after us before Mother, all dolled up like a dog's dinner, as Father put it, was whisked away in the Rolls by the handsome Derek. We were generally left to the care of Kate Speechley, who did not relish her role one bit. Horrid child that I was, I must have made her life very difficult. I remember her plaintive pleas of, "Oh, do be reasonable, pray." When things got too much for her, she would find solace at the piano, playing and singing hymns, which must have tried Father's patience more than somewhat. Mother would return from Nice with a renewed sparkle in her eyes, and with tales of life on the French Riviera and in luxury hotels. Once, when the staff of their hotel were less than courteous and attentive, Mother was horrified to see Edith bestowing lavish tips on them, which immediately turned them into fawning sycophants. When Mother protested that rudeness should not be rewarded with money, Edith explained, "It oils the wheels, Judith, it oils the wheels." When I was about 10, Edith decided she would pay for my education, provided she could choose the school. It was a decision that changed my childhood into a nightmare of misery. For some reason I have never discovered, she chose a Victorian establishment in Sussex, run by two elderly sisters. It was quite Dickensian, harsh and bleak, and offered very little in the way of education, since the teachers were not qualified and books and equipment were minimal. All our letters home were censored, so it took me 2 years to convince my parents of my unhappiness, and I was finally sent to a better school, which Edith declined to finance. As Edith grew older, she became very involved with spiritualism and persuaded Mother to go with her to all kinds of eerie seances. Mother viewed it all with a healthy skepticism, but it had a devastating effect on Edith. She became terrified to be alone, and Minna and Mother spent hours keeping her company and trying to calm her. She told them they would be rewarded by all the money she was going to leave them, and Minna looked forward to years of blissful freedom. However, when Edith died, it was discovered that all her money was held in trust and reverted back to the Chubb family at her death, so no one was able to benefit from her will, and many hopes were dashed. Of course, it is only fair to point out that the Gould family has had its share of oddballs too. Indeed, I might qualify as one myself, since my life can hardly be said to have been conducted along conventional lines. But I think in the oddball stakes I might be beaten by several lengths by Father's cousin, Barbara Gould, who lived near Exeter in Devonshire. She and her brother Hugh, who died while still a young man, were the children of Gramps' brother, Henry Gould. Henry was a farmer of some substance and owned a fine house set on a hill and called Compass Cottage. He married Amy Bath, who was said to have Spanish blood. If so, it would explain Barbara's volatile nature and her dark and swarthy appearance. She had an ungovernable temper, and the least little thing would set it off. When she was a child, Amy would try to curb it, but Henry, who kept horses and rode to hounds, would shout, "Give the filly her head! Don't rein her in!" The result was that the filly grew up ranting and raving in the most alarming fashion. And if she wasn't doing that, she was sitting looking at you with an unblinking stare, finally coming out with a remark like, "You have nice hair," delivered in sepulchral tones. Her one passion was horses and riding. It is said that she and a farm hand would gallop off to Exmoor and round up some of the wild ponies, though what they did with them once they were safely corralled, I have no idea. When Henry died in 1940, Amy and Barbara moved into an undistinguished little house in a row of similar houses on the outskirts of Exeter. Barbara refused to be parted from her favourite horse and kept it in the garage. After Amy died, it was moved into the sitting room, where it remained until Barbara herself died. I have often wondered whether people passing the house in the street were astonished to see a horse gazing at them through the bow window. By the time I was a teenager, Father had risen quite high in the freight department of the P&O. He was responsible for the comings and goings of 2 little cargo boats, the Redcar and the Eston. He had to arrange the cargoes they were to pick up and deliver to ports on the continent. By now, we had outgrown our seaside holidays at Eastbourne, so every summer, when Father took his holidays, he would take us with him for a trip on the SS Eston. The last verse of Masefield's Cargoes describes her exactly. Dirty British coaster with a salt-caked smokestack butting through the channel in the mad March days, with a cargo of time coal, road rails, pig lead, firewood, ironware, and cheap tin trays. We would join the Eston at Tilbury Docks and would be welcomed aboard by Captain Harris and his merry crew. Harris was a big burly sea dog and was kindness itself. He gave up his cabin to Joan and me, and he slept in a bunk behind the wheelhouse. I think Father slept in the saloon where the meals were served, by Fred, the steward. One of the cook's specialities was a red-coloured soup of unknown origin, which was Captain Harris's favourite. He would finish it by smacking his lips and declaring, "That was a nice drop of Nelson's blood." In order to avoid having to have passports, we had to sign on as members of the crew. Joan and I were stewardesses, and when John joined us, he was the bellboy and responsible for ringing the ship's bell every hour. I remember once we left Tilbury on the evening tide and sailed down the Thames at twilight. We met an unforgettable sight coming up the river, the large private yacht of Barbara Hutton, the Woolworth heiress. It was all lit up and dressed over all, and was making its way with stately splendour. Captain Harris welcomed it with a few toots on the ship's siren, and they replied with a few toots of their own as we chugged past. Captain Harris seemed to know all about the yacht, and told us about the bathroom fittings of pure gold, and other features of opulence on board. It was hard to imagine such incredible wealth from a shop that sold nothing over sixpence. On this trip we were going up north to Blythe to take on a cargo of coal. At the various ports we visited, the P&O agent would come aboard and whisk us away for a sightseeing tour and a visit to his home. While the stevedores were loading the coal, we were given a trip down a coal mine and went right up to the coal face where the miners were hacking out the coal with pickaxes. We stayed at the agent's home at Scott's Gap and went with his family on a lovely picnic in the border country. We arrived back on board to find the Eston flying the Blue Peter in preparation for departure, and the crew swabbing down the decks in a massive clean-up from the coal dust. The crew were a delightful and motley collection of great-hearted men. Their living conditions were appalling by today's standards, and it's no wonder they criticised the government of the day. They would hold long political arguments that were always good-humoured, but ended with, "It's the system that's all wrong, mate. We've got to change the system." One of the sailors played the mandolin and tried to teach me how to play it too. He always played music that was full of pathos, like the Volga boat song and other folk songs from Russia, for which he had a great admiration. I believe he went off and fought for the communists in the Spanish Civil War. My favourite among the crew was the boatswain, a large, handsome young man with fair curly hair and a friendly smile. We all spent a lot of time painting the ship to keep pace with the rust, and I would try to work alongside the boatswain. He showed me how to paint properly and not leave any little holidays, as he put it. We would chat away companionably, and he told me all about his family of young children and how he was working for his master's ticket so that he could be a captain one day. We carried the coal over to Rouen, which meant quite a scenic trip up the River Seine under the care of a French pilot. At Rouen, we were greeted by a charming French agent who gave us a wonderful time, showing us the great cathedral, the spot where Joan of Arc was burnt, and other fascinating sights in that ancient city. As we were to be in Rouen a few days while they unloaded the coal and loaded us up with timber, the agent took us to Paris for the day. I was completely captivated by that lovely romantic city, and it was a day I'll never forget. As soon as the holds were full of timber and the hatches battened down, we set sail for Rotterdam. There another agent awaited us with more generous hospitality and sightseeing. I remember we were taken to see a man making wooden clogs that were still extensively worn in those days. While we were at sea one time, I decided to climb the rigging. I had partially mastered the skill of climbing ropes in my gym class, and thought it should be put to some use. The ropes on the ship were somewhat rougher than those in the gym at Winceby House, and on sliding down I scraped my legs quite badly. The scrapes became infected, and Captain Harris came to the rescue. He got out the ship's medicine chest, which was a huge wooden box with bottles of pills and potions, all carefully numbered and fitted into separate compartments. On the inside of the lid was a picture of a man, and all round him were arrows pointing to different parts of his anatomy. The arrows also were numbered, so that if arrow number 3 was pointing to his head, where the patient complained of pain, then you looked for the bottle numbered 3 and gave him a dose of the contents. Arrow number 9 pointed to a nasty wound, so bottle number 9 was taken out and the contents applied to my scrapes. It worked like a charm, and my legs soon healed up. I just hope the rest of the medication in the chest was equally effective, but I'm afraid it must have been a rather hit-and-miss affair. From Rotterdam we went to Belgium, where we had a day in Brussels and visited the World Fair that was on at the time. These carefree holidays on the Eston introduced us to delightful people and foreign ports from Germany to France, and taught us much about the way of the sea and seafaring. It wasn't all smooth sailing, of course. The North Sea could be very tempestuous, and I have been up in the wheelhouse and seen the ship plunge down into a trough and the sea come up to the wheelhouse windows before rising up again above the waves. But it never occurred to me that we were ever in any danger, especially as the ship's log usually described these, to me, rough seas, as a slight swell. When the war came, the Eston was still sailing the seas with its cargoes, but this time in a convoy guarded by the Royal Navy. One day, Captain Harris felt their progress in a convoy was too slow, and that they would be better on their own. Not long after the Eston left the convoy, it hit a mine and went down with all hands. Only one body was washed ashore. It was the boatswain. We were all heartbroken at the loss of our friends and of the gallant little ship. Father died just before the war began, and was spared this devastating news. I know it would have affected him deeply. The war was a time of great upheaval for everyone and changed our lives completely. So I will now bring these reminiscences to a close, hoping that you have found something of interest to amuse you and interest you in these memories of times long past.